Science is interesting, and if you don't agree, you can fuck off.
Welcome to the Darwin Digest, episode 51. This week we are discussing Jewish influence. I am joined, as per usual, by my co-host, Kathy Princess.
Hello.
Unfortunately, Lawrence can't make it tonight, but we do have a very special guest, Dr. Kevin MacDonald, editor of the Occidental Observer and the author of the infamous Culture of Critique series. Say hello, Kevin.
The infamous Culture of Critique series. Hello, I'm here.
Oh, it is. I don't think there's a better description for it, to be honest. It's, but
it's getting pretty well known.
Yeah,
it's the Bible of the alt-right.
Pretty much.
Could be.
It was published. I was 8 years old when that was published, so it's 1998. It's been around for a while. Although I very much doubt that there will be anyone listening to the show that doesn't know about the Culture of Critique. Would you like to just give it just a very quick overview of your work?
Yeah, I wrote 3 books about Judaism. First one, sort of a general book about what it was, especially in traditional societies. Second book on anti-Semitism, and then the third book was almost like an afterthought. But as I was reading all these things, I couldn't help but notice that these Jewish intellectual movements in the 20th century, that they were making very strong critiques of the West. And I started out with Freud and that sort of thing, and psychoanalysis. And the basic idea was that these intellectual movements were essentially providing this devastating critique of the West, and holding up our society to intense moral scrutiny. And oftentimes the basis of that was some feelings of that Jews were persecuted in the past. The point is that these intellectual movements were very highly networked. They were the backbones of all these movements that I discussed were Jewish. And that what that means is that they first of all, identified very strongly as Jews. And secondly, they thought of what they were doing as advancing Jewish interests. And so in the case of Freud and psychoanalysis, he thought of himself as a sort of warrior against Western civilization, trying to undercut the sexual morality of the West and sort of undermine the confidence of the West. He thought of himself as Hannibal, this person who's fighting Rome, which to him represented the West. So he thought of himself as a sort of general at war with the West. So that was in general what the Culture Critique was about. I talked about Jews and the left. Jews have been the backbone of the left throughout the 20th century. First of all, and the most importantly perhaps, in the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and the aftermath of that, which has really, had huge historical consequences, including, I think, National Socialism in Germany, and psychoanalysis, the Frankfurt School, which developed the idea that any kind of identification as a white person, having any kind of white ethnocentrism was a psychopathology, had to be eradicated. There's something wrong with you, and all that. And I talked about one of the most important chapters is a chapter on the movement to change the immigration laws in the United States. But I also have notes on other countries like Australia and the UK and so on. The basic idea being that the big changes, the huge change in immigration policy that happened in the 1960s was the result of Jewish activism. And that, to me, is the most important thing in the long run. These intellectual movements can come and go, and then they're not going to necessarily have a long-range impact. But when you bring in 65, 100 million immigrants, you're going to change the country. You're going to change the culture, and you're going to change the people. You're importing basically a different people. So that is the most important thing that chapter in that book.
Yeah, well, you just mentioned like how a lot of these movements are short-lived, but a lot of the intellectual part, at least their effect, is you wrote about Franz Boas' influence, especially over the American Anthropological Association, and you pointed out they had a 2/3 majority in 1915. What I found really interesting is the same year that Cultural Critique was published in 1998, American Anthropological Association issued a statement essentially denying the existence of race, and that is directly because of his influence. So, like, a lot of these intellectual movements may only be, fly by night, but their influence lasts for a long time. And I was wondering if you could speak to how Jews are able to hold on to institutions so long after that Boas died. Like, what is it, 50 years after he's dead? Like, how?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think what happens is that when Boas was alive, he installed all his graduate students as head of department at the most prestigious universities. And so once these people are in there, they have a sort of gatekeeping function. And it's not as if they only admit Jews. They certainly couldn't possibly do that. They have to admit non-Jews, but they make sure that they are on page, they're the right kind of non-Jews. And we still see that today. I mean, in the academic world, it's intensively policed. You can't get a job, without sort of showing your colors. And that's been especially true, I think, in certain fields. Anthropology is one. Cultural anthropology and physical anthropology were sort of two different disciplines. Cultural anthropology is what was taken over by the Boasians. And I recall when I was on these email wars at my university, and some of them were these anthropologists, and they brought up Boas, and they still have very high respect for Boas. Boas is still sort of the father of cultural anthropology, the idea that biology really is not important in making peoples different. That's that all these cultural differences couldn't possibly be explained by biology. And of course, then they just ignore things like IQ differences and other differences related to, say, impulsivity or other things. So they completely brush that aside, and they focus on this sort of cultural minutiae that you couldn't possibly explain with anything. They exclude people who have different beliefs. I mean, you just don't see that. There are these evolutionary anthropologists, Human Behavior and Evolution Society. So there are anthropologists who sort of get it, but even there, they don't talk about race differences in critical things like IQ. That is still a taboo. And Charles Murray is still, his book was published in 1994, The Bell Curve. He's still getting castigated. Just an article recently how horrible Charles Murray is, so anybody who talks about race differences as explaining anything that is the third whale, and that is what you can't get any money for that. If you do that kind of research, you're going to be ostracized in the university. Phil Rushton did that, of course, at the University of Western Ontario, and he was definitely harassed for it. But he couldn't possibly have started out that way as a young academic. He couldn't have, got his job by saying, "I want to study race differences." That would have been impossible. What he did was he started studying children and things like altruism and so on in children. It's completely innocuous. He just got into this sort of by accident, and by then he was already he's established. I think he had tenure up there in Canada, and they really couldn't get rid of him very easily. But that's the way it has to be. And I get these graduate students who ask me, what can they do, if they want to have a career in the academic world? I say, well, the first thing you have to do is shut up. You can't say a word about your beliefs until you have tenure. And even then, what that means is you're going to be ostracized. You're not going to get any grant money. People won't talk to you anymore. It's that kind of thing. They may not be able to fire you, but they can make your life miserable. And very few people want to put up with that. I mean, who wants a life like that? So it's not going to happen. I mean, if you really want to do serious research, you have to have grant money, and that's not going to happen when you say on your grant proposal, I want to study race differences in IQ. It's just not going to happen.
That's something I've noticed with Evo Psych is that it tends to just sort of it looks at racial differences, but then there's sort of a layer of obfuscation to pretend that it's not actually about race when it really is.
Absolutely.
I think the only reason why they can do that, and I think you followed a similar path, is that everyone looking into Evo Psych has come from a biology background.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you could talk about what is that like? I'm actually quite curious because I'm studying a biology major myself.
Yeah, well, I came out of a biology. I got a master's in biology, and I came into it that way. I never actually took a course in psychology, maybe one course as a graduate student. It was all biology. It was biology behavior and that sort of thing, animal behavior outside of a psychology department. And but evolutionary psychology is very interesting from a sort of political point of view because you got the people who were sort of regarded as the founding people are, Cosmides and Tooby, a husband-wife team, the University of California at Santa Barbara. And they developed this idea that individual differences are not important. And by definition, race differences are not important. And that's just all noise. So intelligence is not important in any kind of individual differences research, because they had the idea that what evolutionary psychologists should be studying about are adaptations, which are universal. All people have hearts and the same brain anatomy and all that. That's what we should be studying. The idea is that all men have certain mating predispositions, women have mating predispositions, that sort of thing. But they're absolutely universal among humans. So you don't study individual differences, and that put all that thing completely under the rug. And so you go to these conferences, and there wouldn't be anything on individual differences. And actually, Phil Rushton would go to these conferences, and he would maybe give a paper, but it was just not part of the central mission that those people thought they were doing, and he could not possibly get published in their journal. So that's the way that worked. I mean, it was very politically correct. I think I saw something on Twitter or something recently that when they actually interviewed evolutionary psychologists at the Human Behavior and Evolution Society meetings, they're quite liberal on everything, including race and immigration, all this stuff. They don't regard race as an important variable in human affairs, and it's mind-boggling. But that's the reality. This sort of school of evolutionary psychology, which is dominant, has managed to become part of the sort of liberal academic establishment, as if nothing is different, and so they're accepted. And you have people, you have departments of psychology hiring evolutionary psychologists because they're not going to really rock the boat. They're not going to do anything to change the status quo.
That's interesting that they're at least some at some institutions they're considered a part of it. The university that I'm a part of, about a year ago, I did a bit of an informal study at the TAV of the postgraduate psych students who were all down there, and I went basically, as part of a conversation, just going around, and I wound up asking them all about Evo Psych, and to a person, they all thought it was basically, it was all just a post hoc rationalization, and it was all basically debunked. And, even something so liberal could be considered too extreme.
That is, I've heard that too. That is another line that evolutionary psychology is just a bunch of what they call just so stories, but it's not true. I mean, when you have, you can have excellent reasons to suppose that there is an adaptation of a particular kind. When I was when I was still doing research, I was studying personality, and my view is that the main personality systems are adaptations. But the thing about it is that there are individual differences in these adaptations. There's for example, one of the adaptations is the affectional system, love. Well, some people are higher in this system and lower, but this is a biological system. It is a neurological system. It's in the brain. It's well studied. And it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view because it's involved in close relationships and bringing up children and cementing family relationships and so on. So it's very functional. So it's just, from my point of view, it's just know-nothingism to say that all these things are just so stories. They haven't read this stuff. There's some of this stuff. I admit I see this. Someone will make a proposal that this is an adaptation, and I'll just sort of, okay, maybe not. They don't really have a lot of evidence for it. But when you can locate what part of the brain it's in, when you can clearly see a function, you see the behavior that's underlying, and so on. It's silly not to say this is not an adaptation. And it's even crazier to think that humans are blank slates. I mean, that's just a non-starter. The idea that humans don't have any proclivities, we don't have any biological, mechanisms. I mean, something like intelligence is another good example. It is an adaptation, but of course there are strong individual differences in it. So if you go to a meeting of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, they will never talk about intelligence because it has all these individual differences in it, and they've just whitewashed all that out of there. But you can pinpoint parts of the brain, talk about working memory.
Yeah, although I'll probably pull us back on track because I know our audience wants to know about a particular topic. So Kathy,
okay.
One of the questions that you have.
Yeah, of course. I just kind of wanted to I know you wanted to get us back on track, but I just kind of wanted to make one observation, just what you were talking about previously, and it's to do kind of with my field, which is sort of more towards healthcare and things like that. And it is sort of funny to hear people talk about massive, racial population differences in things like diabetes risk and things like blood pressure and all sorts of stuff like that, and then. And that sort of racial difference seems to be completely okay to discuss. But, anything to do with above the neck is completely taboo. And yeah, it's just a little observation that I want to make. But yeah, so one of the questions that I had was sort of, I don't know, so do you want me to ask about the future of the evolutionary strategy that the Jews have?
Yeah, that's a good one.
So I'll just set up the question. I mean, obviously, with the mass immigration of non-whites into European countries, a lot of them are very hostile to Jews as such, especially, the Middle Eastern portion of that. And I can't imagine, Africans having any sympathy towards the Jewish problem. So what do you think the future of this current Jewish evolutionary strategy is going to be in the light of these coming races being, relatively hostile to them?
That's a very good question. I think that the basic Jewish idea was, and to some extent still is, the idea that these different groups can be managed. That once they get here to the West, they can be sort of managed to be on our side. And you certainly see that Jewish groups have reached out to all these other groups, including Muslim groups, Hispanic groups, Black groups, Asian groups, and so on. They have these umbrella organizations that are organized by Jews, very strong Jewish involvement, funded by Jews. And, they want to make these connections. Fundamentally, they are making a coalition against white America or white Australia, whatever it is, whatever country they're in. And actually, right now in Oxford Observer, we have a series by Brenton Sanderson on Australia. It's titled the Jewish War on White Australia, and it talks about the propaganda in this case. But he's also talking about immigration policy and other aspects of this. But anyway, it's like that in every Western country where Jews are organizing coalitions of non-whites, non-Europeans against the European population. And what we see, of course, is the racialization of politics. So the white people are now voting in America, predominantly voting in the Republican Party. And so you see racial polarization. But I think that this strategy may be coming apart. As you say, with the Muslims especially, have often had times hostility towards Jews, and especially towards Israel. And Africans have no concern for the Holocaust. You're not going to make Africans feel guilty or care about the Holocaust. The same with Latinos. So I think that and what we see is when these Muslims get in and start to have some political power, as in the UK, I think is especially a good example, where if you look at the Labour Party, it's become quite anti-Israel. And it's been abandoned quite extensively by its Jewish donors. I mean, essentially that party was sort of the heart and soul of the left in the UK, and it was very much Jewish involvement, intellectually and financially, and media and everything else. But essentially, what the Labour Party did was abandon its original constituency, the white working class, and instead, of course, they're championing migration and multicultural and everything. So, but I think Jews are starting to feel that they have a problem because it's become anti-Israel, and that is a major problem for them. So I think, and of course, the other problem is street crime. I mean, like especially I think in France, where Jews have been accosted on the street by these migrants, especially by Muslims. Quite a few Jews are emigrating to Israel and so on. So I don't think that's going to change, Jewish power in France. It's still there. It's going to be in the media, going to be in campaign contributions and that sort of thing. But many of the average Jews that have to deal with this kind of stuff on the street are leaving France for that reason. So I do think that it's a problematic strategy for Jews in the long run. These new peoples don't really like Jews, and it's possible that they'll succeed. I mean, what they mainly want is a coalition against whites, and that seems to be working just fine. All these immigrant groups seem to be very easy to indoctrinate into hostility against whites, but it may not be the case that Jews can completely control this and manage it in the long run. It's not clear at this point.
Yeah, I mean, if you sort of people coming, from a normie perspective are always, they're always confused about this seeming alliance between, for example, feminists and Muslims. But obviously, if you know who is behind that, it becomes completely clear. So, and yeah, you do get, the occasional article every now and then about the Jews complaining of rising anti-Semitism in Germany, and we know unfortunately it's not the Germans, but it's the new arrivals that are the cause of it. So, yeah, I think you're right in the sense that it won't affect the power structure, but it will just spur further emigration into Israel. Something that they are able to do, and that kind of brings me to another question that I did have. And so in the alt-right we talk about this kosher sandwich where you have the left-wing Jews and the right-wing Jews. And all the Gentiles stuck in between. And in cultural critique, I talked about really the evolution of a lot of these kind of radical Jewish movements into the neoconservative movement. But yeah. I was wondering if you could comment about sort of the modern leftist anti-Zionist Jews. Where do they kind of fit into that, and what's their strategy? Do they have they just kind of been left behind by the sort of pro-Israel, pro-Zionist faction, or what's going on there?
Well, I think it's certainly the case that we can't lump all Jews into one category. There are Jews who are very critical of Israel. I think of Philip Weiss and Manda Weiss. I read that pretty regularly. They are very critical of Israel, but at the same time, they strongly identify as Jews. They want to persuade the Jewish community to take a stance on Israel that would, sort of give the Palestinians a state, and they would sort of solve this problem. But of course, they can't do that because in Israel, the politics of Israel are on the far, far right. If we had a government that was as ethno-nationalist in the United States as the government of Israel is in Israel, I mean, we'd have pretty much solved all our problems. So these American Jews like Philip Weiss is they're sort of genuine liberals, and they're horrified by what Israel's doing to the Palestinians. At the same time, they're just fine with massive non-white immigration. They want all of that, of course they're powerless to change anything in Israel. And if you look at all the big money in the United States is pro-Zionist. They're pro-Israel. I mean, you don't get really big Jewish money funding anti-Israel stuff. With maybe, actually George Soros has done some of that. He's not really. He's done some anti-Israel kinds of stuff because I think again he's probably a genuine leftist and he really believes in this stuff, I guess. But what he's doing is ruining America and Europe.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you have the Jews that are sort of more in tune with the evolutionary strategy, and then some that actually kind of genuinely believe their own message that they're spreading.
Yeah, I think that there are sort of different conceptions of what that strategy should be. In other words, people like Philip Weiss would like Israel to be the sort of liberal state. I think they would like to, probably have the Palestinians have their own area, not expel them, but just give them a separate area. They would still want Israel to be a Jewish state. They would want Israel to bar, other types of immigrants and migrants and refugees. But they want to give the Palestinians a break. They're horrified by what they're doing to the Palestinians. But that's just one view, and right now it's still not where the big money is. I mean, the big money is foursquare for Israel, for Netanyahu's government, and often the big money in America has pushed Israel to the right. In the 90s that was happening quite a bit, but so I don't see these people having a big influence. Their main goal, if you look at what they actually do, they're mainly interested in making America non-white. And they make this anti-Israel stuff, sort of sloganeering, They don't have any power in that area, but they have a lot of power and a lot of influence when it comes to what's going on in America. I see that, actually, right. It's interesting that some of the faculty email us at my university, and you see these Jewish study guys. They're more on the defensive now, I think, trying to defend Israel. But at the same time, they're very left wing and they're very much involved in all social justice movements and everything like that. So they're just trying to sort of blunt the anti-Israel stuff, but at the same time promoting massive non-white immigration and multiculturalism. That's really their game.
Yeah, there's a concept in microbiology called quorum sensing, where bacteria are kind of able to work out what every other bacteria is doing, and they can, if there's enough of them getting the one spot, they can just sort of they can change their behavior dramatically to whatever end goal they've got. And to me, that seems very similar to almost how like Jews sort of manage to organize themselves without oversight.
It's interesting.
They jump on whatever's in vogue and whatever deals with their morals, but then you've also got all different you've got different Jews, like you said, pushing for different things, and then but behind all of that, they all sort of have the same goal. Like you said, in America, it's to make America non-white.
It's really hard to find Jews in America who do not believe in that. I mean, someone like Paul Gottfried maybe is an exception, but it's like you could count them on fingers of one hand, basically, to find Jews who are opposed to massive non-white immigration into Western countries. That's really hard to do. To find differences of opinion on Israel, that's pretty easy to do. But when it comes to immigration and multiculturalism, it's pretty hard.
Yeah, they're one massive force. And another thing, to move on to one of our other questions, another thing that they all are in lockstep for is the Holocaust. And they sort of use that as it's a force multiplier for Jewish influence. I was wondering if you could describe that.
Well, yes, the Holocaust has become a weapon that is wielded very, 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 very adeptly by these Jewish groups. essentially it rationalizes Israel, but it also rationalizes, refugee policy, immigration policy. And if you oppose, I mean, when the whole refugee thing was happening in Europe, there were just dozens of articles in the Jewish media about how if you oppose refugees coming into Europe, it's just like back in the 1930s and 1940s when Jews were refugees and they couldn't go into America. They think of refugee policy from the standpoint of Jewish interests only and Jewish history only. They don't think about what's good for America, and so it's their own perception of history. There was this big a ship called it was the St. Louis, and it had these refugees, these European Jewish refugees, and they were trying to come to America. While America wouldn't let them in. They were trying to go to South America. Countries would not let them in. Cuba wouldn't let them in. Eventually, they went back to where they came from in Europe, and that is the allegory. Every Jew who's had any education at all in America knows that story. And when they see anything about refugee policy, they say, you have to keep the doors open because, 60, 70 years ago, we were tapped out. That's the message that they have. And that is essentially what Jews are operating in when it comes to refugee policy and immigration policy. They see it in terms of the Holocaust. Even in America, we had a law in 1924 that restricted immigration, right? It was passed because, really overwhelming consensus, and the Jewish activists fought tooth and nail against it, but they lost. But ever after that, and especially after World War II, when Jews were, involved in the Holocaust in Europe, they then said that this 1924 law was contributing to the Holocaust. So now America enacting something, 20 years almost before World War II, that has become part of a Jewish lore. That the 1924 immigration law was racist and anti-Semitic, and it resulted in Jews dying in the Holocaust. You see all these educated Jews saying exactly that. And it's just an amazing phenomenon. But yeah, we have a culture of the Holocaust. I mean, dozens of movies, books. It's become a sacred cow. And of course, especially in Europe, they have laws about what we can say about it. It's taught in the schools very early on. And again, the message isn't only about Jews as victims. It's about the need to welcome all non-Europeans into their country. If you don't, you're going along with the Holocaust.
What I find really interesting about it is I think it's kind of tied into like the ascent of the alt-right, in that they've thrown their lot in on the Holocaust. If all of their power almost sort of is centered around it, and the moment people stop caring about it, they lose a lot of face. They lose a lot of their ability to affect events. And I think that's kind of what the alt-right has done, is just say, yeah, I don't care.
Whatever. Yeah, I think that's right. It's not like the people on the alt-right go into and dispute things about the concentration camp. They say, well, there were no gas chambers. They're just saying, we don't care. It's not important for us. We're concerned about our survival. We don't want this being used against us. And we really reject the idea of white guilt for anything, whether it's the Indians treating conquering the continent and all that. We've seen this over and over again in human history. We're simply not going to feel guilty about those things. And whatever happened in World War II, that's not a reason for us to commit cultural and demographic suicide, whatever it was. So let's get beyond that, okay?
Yeah, exactly. Like, it doesn't matter what happened. What matters is that we're dying now. And
exactly.
Yeah, I think it's quite important for us to understand. Although I'll just shift gears very, very slightly to go back to the previous question. Where do you think anti-Zionist Jews fit into all of this? Sorry, we're bouncing around all over the place, but I'm just I've got a big list of questions.
No, that's okay. There are anti-Zionist Jews. Are you talking about these Orthodox Jews who just think Israel was a mistake, or are you talking about people like Philip Weiss?
That's Kathy's question, so I'll let her answer that.
Yeah.
Well, it'd be interesting to comment on both of them because they're so very different. I mean, on the one hand, you have this weird religious sect, and on the other hand, you have, I guess, this sort of hyper liberal. So maybe if you could comment on both of those in the context kind of with the Holocaust.
Yeah, with the Ultra-Orthodox Jews, I think that's just a mental aberration. These people are very strange in many ways. But when it comes to thinking about people like Philip Weiss and people, Jews who are genuinely critical of Israel, I think that they see themselves as genuine liberals, and they want to be consistent. And they see what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. They're horrified, and they want Israel to be a good liberal state. They would still want it to be Jewish in a way that they don't want. These same people don't want America to be white or Europe to remain European. But they do want Israel to be more humane, to give the Palestinians some land and some rights and so on. But I don't know. It's a different way of seeing Jewish interests, I think. And you see people like Mir Sharma who are not Jewish, of course, but they are very critical of Israel. And they frame it in terms of what is good for Israel. But in the long run, Israel can't do this. They can't continue to oppress the Palestinians, to do the ethnic cleansing, to do all that with impunity. And sooner or later, we'll catch up to them. But my argument against those guys is basically that the people who are running politics in Israel are just extremely ethnocentric now, and they are not open to that. They want that land, and they are willing to, rule over the Palestinians. And crush them, really. They have no compunctions about that. And they think they can win. They're armed to the teeth. They have very powerful, lobbying groups in the United States and elsewhere. And they think they can win this. And so I don't think they're going to stop. So I don't think these liberal Jews who are criticizing Israel are simply not going to have an effect. And I think it sort of gives a lot of these Jews a sort of way of thinking good about themselves and feeling okay, as their main activism really involves trying to get more non-whites into European countries and the United States and so on. So I think that is how I see these people. I see them as Jews of a different kind, but nevertheless Jews who have a very strong sense of Jewish interests. Their sense of Jewish interest is Israel should be mollified, but so what if we can't really change that policy? At the same time, they advocate everything on the left in America. They want more and more non-whites. They want all of this stuff. So it's just another way of being Jewish, basically, I think.
Another way of being Jewish. One thing I found really interesting about the sort of the interplay between the ultra-Orthodox and the liberal Jews and the ultra-liberal Jews is birth rates. In the very, very left-leaning, freedom Jews, they've got a lot. They've got far greater rates of like homosexuality, transgenderism, all that sort of stuff, and they have almost no birth rate. Whereas the Orthodox have this, they're just pumping out kids, and it kind of is like a reservoir for new ultra left-leaning Jews to come from Orthodox families, and to say, well, that's not for me. I'm going to go be a whatever.
Exactly.
And it's a really interesting interplay there as well. It's kind of, even though they're so diametrically opposed inside of their own culture, the one is propping the other one up.
Yeah, I think one of my ideas about Orthodox Judaism is that it's sort of suppressed all these sexual aberrations that were sort of just below the surface, like homosexuality. There's some data that that there are higher rates of homosexuality among Jews. And it could be that there are some genes there that are beneficial in some ways, but at the same time, in Orthodox communities, that behavior was suppressed. But now, when they get out of that situation, then it's not suppressed anymore, and they become overtly homosexual. But I think you're right that the Orthodox community provides a sort of demographic wellspring for the Jewish community as a whole. And so many of them behave maladaptively. They don't have families. They're gay. They have very small families. See some statistics that if say 50 years from now, almost all the Jews that exist in the United States will have ancestors in the Orthodox community, in the immediate, say, within that period. In other words, that the future Jews are going to come from the Orthodox community, and so there's a constant sort of peeling off of Jews from the Orthodox community into the mainstream community, and at which time they become typically Jewish in their attitudes. They become on the left and so on, or on the neoconservative right. And so it's a tough, it's a very adaptive thing that they do, really, and you got to hand it to them.
Yeah, it's especially given the birth rates for that particular demographic. It's the same with Europeans as well. It's the it seems like an almost optimal solution to that problem. We Europeans obviously don't have some mass population breeding Scandinavian pagan, but they do, and they make use of it.
Yes, and we have some people who are like for example, the Mormons are quite adaptive, but they're relatively small compared to the white population as a whole. They're not going to really change things. Yeah, we have to change our outlook on marriage and the family and having children. That's the most important thing we can do, I think, to help ourselves. Apart from political activism directed at erecting borders and developing a sense of white identity and white interest. That's what has to be paramount here. Without those two things, we are going to be. It's going to be a genocide. We're going to lose out. If we project things forward a couple 100 years, we're not going to be around very much. We're just going to be brought out of existence.
At the start of Culture of Critique, you give a table of differences between genetics and the differences between Europeans and Jews. I'm just bringing it up on my iPad. What would you say that hypothetically you're able to change European behavior? Would you make it more Jewish in some ways, or would there be a different path that you would go down?
Yeah, well, I think, the contrast I make there is between individualism, which is characteristic of Europeans, especially Northern Europeans, Northwestern Europeans, and Judaism, which is very collectivist. And I think a large part of our problem has been individualism. That is, we don't see ourselves as a collectivity very easily compared to the Jews and other people. I mean, individualism is unique around the world. You don't see any other culture, whether it's China, India, the Arab countries, Africa. You don't see individualism as characteristic. And so a lot of my writing has been trying to understand European individualism. I'm trying to write a book on it. And it's much harder to write about that than it is to write about what are Jews about. Because you want to understand individualism as how it developed. And what's the ethnic component there and everything. But it is a problem because we don't think of ourselves as a collectivity. We don't think of ourselves as having common interests. It's easiest. We're not as ethnocentric as other peoples by nature. And I think under certain circumstances, we can become more. I think we are feeling more threatened now. I think whites are developing a sense of being under threat. A lot of Trump voters, I think, were voting because they were afraid of what the future might bring. They could see their areas where they live in changing. They could see, other people's coming in, not really trusting, not signing on to the idea that this future is going to be all that wonderful for whites once they're a minority. So I think whites are waking up, but it takes more for us to get a sense of collective interest than it does for other peoples, and especially that's true, I think, in north of Europe. I think that's why I think Sweden is so fascinating. Sweden is a laboratory of radical individualism, and you can see what's happening over there. They just, they want to be a humanitarian superpower, and they're letting all these people in, and they can't stop the crime, and nothing is. Sweden is really a laboratory of white pathology. It seems to me. Really, I think it's pathology that is more extreme in the north and west of Europe, Scandinavia, Germany to some extent, not as much, but parts of the British Isles, and then definitely extremely individualistic. Northern France, the Germanic areas, relatively individualistic. And it's been, on one hand, it's produced the modern world, intense dynamism that individualism produces. At the same time, it's allowed groups like these Jewish groups to come in and, still retain their sense of collective interest, their ethnic networking, and they can win. I mean, those collectives, these powerful, intelligent groups of strongly ethnically identified people can definitely defeat a bunch of individualists, no matter how smart they are.
You mentioned the period where we were exploring the world, and most of the listeners will know we're not really exploring the universe right now. And I think a lot of that is we were sort of in a Goldilocks zone of individualism and collectivism. We were collectivist enough to sort of retain a cultural identity, a willingness to strive for your own people, self-sacrifice, to sacrifice for your people as well. So it used to be a huge theme in European literature. And what Jewish influence has done is it sort of helped push us, which we're going there by ourselves anyway, but Jews are kind of an accelerating factor from what I've seen to push us towards hyper individualism.
I agree.
So, I feel like we need to go back to that Goldilocks zone.
Yeah, well, one of the things that really struck me in writing the Culture Critique was when I studied the Frankfurt School, and these guys were Marxists, when they started out, and then they realized that the real problem was not social class; it was race and ethnicity. And they got the idea that what was really wrong was a sense of ethnocentrism. Well, what is ethnocentrism? It's a sense of collectivity, isn't it? And what they really then ended up prizing was the radical individual, who was completely cut off from his family, from his religion, from his people, from his nation. And so you had this radical individualism being promoted by the Frankfurt School Jewish intellectuals who were strongly identified Jews who saw their work as advancing Jewish interests. I mean, it's the most obvious hypocrisy. But yes, they have been pushing radical individualism and promoting it to a greater extent than I think we would have been otherwise. I do think that it's not as if whites don't have any sense of ethnocentrism. We do, and we can, and all these experiments in social psychology showing that it's very easy to get a sense of group interest in people, in humans. That's a human universal. It's not necessarily based on ethnicity, but any kind of human group. We can form ethnocentric groups, and you could certainly see that happening in the 1930s with National Socialism in Germany. They had a strong sense of commitment to group goals, a strong sense of who they were, and a pride in themselves and their history and their culture and everything else. That's what's been destroyed here, and it's been destroyed in the name of go shopping, consumer goods. Don't identify with your group. Just try to live a more comfortable life or whatever. Get a nice car. That's the goals that we've been, and it's easy. It's white people are prone to that. I mean, we resonate to that kind of stuff. We don't. We have weak family ties, and in a way that's adaptive to have. We don't We don't have extended kinship relationships. We haven't for centuries. But this is now really becoming our undoing because of the propaganda that keeps being put out by these hostile elites.
Yeah, there's a theme I generally like to sort of push a little bit. There's two parts to it, like that we need to essentially constantly be struggling because that's how essentially it provides that pressure for evolution to do its work. When there is none of that pressure on a population, you find that they get all sorts of you'll find that they'll eventually, develop maladaptions that when there is a pressure applied, completely screws them over. And I see individualism as, or at least hyper-individualism, as one of those maladaptions. So in a sort of sense, I find it interesting that I wonder if we need an eternal Jew, as it were, to be constantly pushing against us that we can that we can work with. That's something I've been thinking about recently, because if we were to go into space and completely move on from there, that's not going to end well.
No. I sometimes wonder what our history would be like if there were no Jews in Europe. It'd be quite different, and I'm not sure exactly what would have happened. But individualism has its good points. But as you say, I mean, part of what's happened is that we've become so wealthy, and we have vacations and tasty food and good cars, and we have an easy life, and I think that it does make us complacent. You think about that adventuring Faustian spirit that Ricardo Duchesne talks about. That's missing in so many of us now. We don't see that sense of striving and wanting to perfect yourself and wanting to reach beyond and explore new things and conquer new things and that sort of thing. And that Indo-European influence on our culture it's hard to even find it anymore. I think some of us on the alt-right are very sort of aware of that. I mean, if you look at Ricardo Duchesne's writing, he really features explorers. That exploration was a European thing. And there was no other people that cared about going out and finding other new peoples and what the world was like and everything else the way Europeans did. And they encountered danger and all kinds of things, various obstacles, and they overcame them. And that is the essence of the West. And we're losing that. And consumer culture and just radical individualism with no sense of their own, posterity or anything like that. The Indo-Europeans were individualistic, and that, individualism is part of our culture, part of our nature. The Indo-Europeans, they wanted fame. It was the most important thing. To go down in history as someone who was a great warrior, to have people talking about you after you were dead. The fame of a dead man's deeds, as William Pierce said. That was what your Indo-European culture was all about. But now it's sort of like, I'm going to go on vacation. I'm gonna get high or whatever. That's what it's about.
That William Pierce quote is actually from the Hovermal, which is Old Norse text, and
that's what it was about.
And it's, men die, cattle die, kinsmen die, you will die, but the one thing that lives forever is the deeds of a great man.
That's right.
And the Indo-Europeans is a great example as well. They as far as we know, that they invented chariots, and they had this huge migration.
Yeah.
And we kind of embodied that, as Europeans, we kind of embodied that all the way up until the space race. And then we stopped. Yeah. And if we hadn't stopped, we would have colonies on Mars. And just think about that. That there's a sort of an idea that that once we've got a sustainable population off planet, then an event that annihilates Earth will not end the human race and will not end Europeans by extension, obviously.
Yeah.
We can't do that anymore because of this Jewish influence and because of all this migrants they brought in and the huge welfare burden that's all placed on us. Like we've gone from explorers and conquerors to menials.
Tax cattle.
As just
sheeple.
Yeah, sheeple, yes. But yeah, it's just a huge thing.
It's Pharisee.
On the topic of Indo-Europeans and ancient history, from our last episode, I actually covered the Khazar hypothesis in the light of some new research. I was wondering if you were aware of it and your opinion on the Khazar hypothesis.
I've never been a fan of it. I've yet to see a study that is convincing on it, and I'm persuaded by the fact that, for example, that Yiddish is a Germanic language. My view is a standard view that Jews were in the Roman Empire and they headed east to Poland and other areas of Eastern Europe where they could go. They were banned from Russia for a long time. I see, what I'm impressed with are population genetic studies showing a genetic commonality among all Jewish groups, and essentially a Middle Eastern origin. And if you look at Jewish culture, it's very Middle Eastern. The Middle East is a segmentary society. That is, unlike the West. One of the things about Indo-Europeans that really struck me, and is a big part of that paper I wrote on Indo-Europeans, is that when Indo-Europeans came into an area, they didn't just exterminate people. They dominated them, but gradually the barriers between them and the people they dominated broke down. So after that, when the Roman Empire fell, you had these Germanic groups, the Goths going into, France and Spain and so on. And for a while there were barriers there, but then they broke down. In the Middle East, those barriers can last for thousands of years. The barriers are permanent. And so within Israelite society, as depicted in the Old Testament, you had these groups that were conquered, the ones that weren't exterminated when they came over from Egypt. They remained in Israelite society for centuries. The barriers were not broken down. And that's what happened. That's typical of the Middle East. Whereas European societies, those barriers break down. We're more individualistic. People start making marriages on the basis of social class, not ethnicity so much. And so you saw the old Roman, the old Roman families that were successful gradually married into the Gothic families and so on. So that's the kind of thing that happens in the West, where we don't maintain these barriers very well. And that's part of our individualism. But we have to regain that Indo-European mentality. And unfortunately, part of my research, I'm really heading in the direction of that a big part of our current mentality is much more centered in the north of Europe, not so much the Indo-European mentality. The north of Europe being much more egalitarian, much more individualistic than the Indo-Europeans were even. And, again, Sweden is my test case of hyper-individualism. It's a very interesting culture that I've been reading this stuff lately on Sweden, on Swedish history. And what they were saying is that the Swedish welfare state, you say, well, that's collectivist. Well, it wasn't really. The whole point of this welfare state was to sort of free up individuals so that they wouldn't have any obligations to family or anything else. So a woman could just get pregnant and live. And there wouldn't be no obligation apart from your own individual interest. That was the rationale of Swedish welfare state. I mean, it's radically individualist. And again, it's far more individualistic than the European model, which I think did have more of a sense of collectivity, at the same time being very individualistic. I mean, they wanted to excel. They wanted to be better than anybody else.
Is that not the opposite of the sort of Scandinavian conformist mentality as well? Because if you've heard of the concept of Jante's law, you're not supposed to excel. It's kind of really the opposite of what it used to be in many ways.
That's the thing. And that's the conundrum, that the most difficult thing about trying to understand Europeans. Because the other aspect, on the one hand, Swedes are radically individualistic. On the other hand, there's this absolutely smothering conformity in Sweden, and where they don't want to get out of line in criticizing, immigration or anything like that. It's the paradox of individualism, I call it. My view is that what evolved in the far north, as opposed to the Indo-Europeans, were these hunter-gatherer groups that were based not on kinship. They were individualistic, but they were not based on extended families, like in every other part of the world. But they had a sense of a moral in-group, that they had to be on page, that they had to maintain their reputation in a moral in-group in order to survive. And so, on the one hand, they are not kinship-oriented. They're very weak family structure. There's a recent academic paper comparing family structures throughout the world. Basically, very strong extended kinship families in the Middle East. It's getting weaker into Europe with Germany and so on. You get to Scandinavia, radically weak. No sense of extended kinship relationships. And so I'm thinking Northern Europe is an extreme on this human dimension of family structure. And unfortunately, I think that is what is becoming dominant, whereas the older Indo-European mentality is shrinking and almost non-existent in people, among our elites now. We don't have that sense of, wanting to excel, this strong sense of wanting to become famous, for your talked about in history. And it's much more egalitarian. I think the Swedes, very egalitarian. They don't want to stand out in a way. And it's so odd. It's such a paradox because you have this radical conformity combined with radical individualism. Try to wrap your mind around that is very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about sort of the origin of Indo-Europeans for a second. I mean, as far as I know, as far as the archaeological evidence suggests, I mean, the homeland was sort of, the Ukrainian steppe,
Exactly.
If anything else. Yeah. So Scandinavia is actually quite far removed from,
right.
The origin of the actual Indo-Europeans as such. And then it was one of the last places to be colonized by the migrations.
It probably was, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things you mentioned about sort of, Indo-Europeans kind of assimilating, into the local culture in some ways. I mean, I think one counterexample to that would probably be India, where,
right.
The very strict caste system is basically still in place. I mean, it was kind of ruined by the Anglos, but it was there obviously for a very good reason, which was a very racial reason, to keep the Dravidians and the Aryans separate.
Right. I think that is a good example. But I think what happened was when they went to Europe, they encountered people much more like themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you didn't set up those barriers the way they did in India.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Iran was a complete assimilation from the people, the Indo-Iranians and the population that was already there. Like they completely folded in. There's no recognizable differences as another example. So it's even of that wave that went from Iran then into eventually into India. I think, like Kathy said, it might have just been sort of a function of they rock up in this place and there's a sort of two populations there already, for lack of, forgive my vulgarity with this, but smart ones and dumb ones. You know which ones you're going to pick.
Yeah, right. And ones that are very, very much different racially from you, and one that's, they're quite similar. So I think that's a significant thing. I think one question that I did want to ask, kind of getting back to the Jews, and related to India as well. In the episode that we did do on kind of the origin and the sort of the background of the Jews, I did a segment about sort of the Jews of India and China, and there have been Jewish populations in both of these places, for a very long time, but neither seem to have been very successful And I was wondering whether you had any idea of why that was the case, especially in China. I mean, there basically no more Chinese Jews. They were, completely assimilated, and then they kind of even forgot their own origins in many ways. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think one thing that happened with Jews is the Ashkenazi Jews are really the powerhouse of the Jewish community, and they do have significant European admixture, 40% maybe. You still see the strong Middle Eastern component, but there has been a small, if like 1% every generation interbreeds, and a lot of this is not something that's approved by the Jewish community, but things happen. You have affairs and rapes and so on, and so there's a certain amount of admixture. So 1% every generation, when you got 40 generations, and it builds up. And the other thing is that some of the evidence shows that the original Ashkenazi population consisted of Jewish males interbreeding with European females in Italy, I guess, or elsewhere. I think Italy. So that would give a huge European influence in the Ashkenazi group, and that may be partly why they are as talented as they are. I mean, if you look at IQ, the Ashkenazi Jews are much more intelligent, say, than these Oriental Jews, and I'm sure that's true of the Jews that went to India. So you do see differences within the groups, and it could be, admixture of European genes partly, but it's also selection within the Jewish community. I mean, there was strong eugenic selection pressures for IQ in Jewish communities. If you were really smart and could master the Talmud and be like a rabbi kind of person, you would have a good marriage, you'd have a lot of kids, whereas Jews who were not very intelligent really got pushed to the sideline, or were much more likely to actually convert or get out of the Jewish community or be pressured out of the Jewish community. They weren't much appreciated. Whereas the intelligent Jews, were the ones who were always given the best marriages, business opportunities, and so on.
It's interesting that we did the opposite with the Catholic Church. The most intelligent of us a few hundred years ago joined the church because that was the way that you essentially got not necessarily literate, but it was the easy way into academia, really.
Yeah, it really was. At the same time, though, I think marriage was eugenic in Europe until about 1800. At least that's Richard Lynn's proposal, I think. And then you started seeing poor people having more children, but that's a recent thing. It's say in the Middle Ages and in the early modern era, people with more wealth, the aristocrats, had more children, more surviving children than poor people. But then that all changed in the modern world.
And
probably not good.
Even the concept of like aristocrats not doing, like, the pompous, extremely wealthy not doing much, has only been around for probably like no more than 1,000, other than the very, very crust, other than them, that idea hasn't really been around for a huge period of time. Like, I can't imagine it being more than a few thousand years. There are obviously probably a couple of notable exceptions in history, probably Rome, but other than that, like, you look at the barbarian tribes in Europe at that period of time, at the time of Christ, even though they were under Roman rule, they, even the best of them today, we would think of them more as peasants than anything else.
Yeah, I think European populations have shown that there was huge talent, in the lower orders that was unleashed by the modern world. And there's probably some selection. This historian Clark talks about Farewell to Alms, talking about selection that people in England, in the UK, in the early modern era, who had more ambition or more industrious, more intelligence, they had more children. and that is part of the story going into the modern era, that we lost a lot of the lower IQ, more impulsive type people along the wayside.
Just to move back to Jews for a bit again, the one last question that I really had was about Jewish, their hyper ethnocentrism. In Culture of Critique, you have a quote by Rabbi, I'm going to butcher the name, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, and the source material is quite long, and you've cut it down quite a bit, obviously, to fit in the book. But there's one part that you left out that I think speaks quite closely to what their sort of worldview is, and it's I'll just read it out and then I'll go through the rest of the question. The general difference between Jews and non-Jews: a Jew was not created as a means for some other purpose. He himself is the purpose, since the substance of all divine emanations was created only to serve the Jews. The important things are the Jews, because they do not exist for any other aim. They themselves are the divine aim. The entire creation of a non-Jew exists only for the sake of Jews. And I just,
It's quite a quote.
It's quite a quote. Whilst I think that we need to move more along a more ethnocentric line, I think where we need to aim is not that far. And so
we don't have to go that far, I agree.
Yeah, and so I was just wondering, at what point are we ethnocentric enough?
Well, I think we're ethnocentric enough if we identify as white people and have a sense of white interests and are willing to pursue them and do whatever we can. And that would mean creating white homelands or creating explicitly white states. I mean, America in 1950 was 90% white, okay? I mean, it wouldn't have been ridiculous at all for whites to proclaim, okay, this is a white state. And other blacks here, we'll treat them fairly, but this is a white state. And we're going to continue that way. And it was implicitly that way, and almost explicitly, because our immigration policy at that time was geared towards Northwest Europe. Well, that was basically saying we want to stay a European country. That would have been sufficient. But then you had these Jewish intellectual movements, the Jewish movement to end the immigration restriction and bias of immigration policy towards Northwest Europe. And the rest is history. We've imported tens of millions of people now, changed the demographic balance. The idea that this is a white country would be greeted with intense hostility by so many people now. But we have to go back there. We have to do that. I think that's what fundamentally the alt-right is all about: having a sense of ethnic interests and being willing to pursue them, and not being ashamed of it, and not being guilty about the past, and not necessarily wanting to treat others unfairly, but doing what we have to do to survive, to create a culture and a piece of land where we can flourish.
I think that's quite well said. Kathy, did you have any more questions?
No, I think all the ones I had have been covered.
All right, I think that's a fantastic way to wrap up. Okay. Dr. MacDonald, would you like to let everyone know where they can find you, and if there's anything you would like to plug, go ahead.
Yeah, well, as you said at the beginning, I edit the Occidental Observer. Right now we have an article by Brenton Sanderson, a very good writer, and he's going to have a collection of his essays. He's got a whole series on the war against white Australia, talking about Jewish involvement in immigration policy in Australia. I had a little note on that in my 1998 book, but he's expanded this greatly. And he's done great work in that area. It's a 4-part series. This is on the propagandizing of Australian school children, about the Holocaust and everything else. But the Occidental Observer is where I edit, and I have written quite a bit. I'm working right now on a book on Europeans. As I say, Europeans are the hardest group to understand. We're unusual. But also my website is kevinmacdonald.net. I have a lot of my academic writings on there, evolutionary psychology, all the papers I've written about the West, about Europeans, and of course my writing on Jews and Jewish influence and so on is there. So that's kevinmacdonald.net and the Occidental Observer. I also edit the Occidental Quarterly, which is more academically oriented journal, academic articles on various topics, but generally they are related to Europeans, our sense of interest, and so on. You know, white culture, white interests, and the threats that we face now.
All right.
Excellent.
And
yeah.
I also believe that you have a Twitter account, which I'll post as well in the show notes, and all of that will be as well. I'm
very interested in Twitter, by the way. I love Twitter. I have I just got over 21,000 followers, but I enjoy it. I think Twitter is becoming the social media for at least for people who have some brains. I really do. I think it's the best social media because you can link other things, and you can make pithy comments, and you can even make extended comments, and you can paste pictures of paragraphs and so on in there, and so it's really a good medium to get your ideas out and to engage people intellectually one-on-one, and I find it just indispensable now.
It's from like a memnetic point of view. It's really interesting. It's a distillation. You have to distill every idea down to the most basic and the most important points, and you've only got 144 characters.
140 characters. I'm always taking words out, and rephrasing and so on. So it makes you write a little differently. But I think it's really good. My Twitter handle is at TOOEdit. That's my Twitter name.
Yeah, and that will be in the show notes as well. As for the Jewish War on White Australia articles, all of the dingoes, and I'll be posting this in our chats as well, all of the dingoes definitely should read this. I went through this as a kid, so it would be really interesting to read through that myself. Anyway, This has been the Darwin Digest, episode 51, where we've been discussing various things, but mostly Jewish influence. Thank you very much for coming and chatting with us, Dr. MacDonald.
I very much enjoyed it. We can do it again if you want.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure.
All right,
thank you.
See ya.
Okay, bye-bye.